Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of History Debunked. Today we're diving deep into the world of the Vikings, those fearless warriors of the North who are often romanticized in modern culture. But how much of what we know about them is actually true? In this video, we're going to explore some of the biggest myths about the Vikings and explain why they're simply not accurate. We'll also take a closer look at the political structure of the Vikings and how they governed themselves. But that's not all. We'll also explore the role of Christianity among the Vikings and how it affected their reputation. We'll investigate how accurate the written sources from the Middle Ages regarding the Vikings and their actions really are, and the logic that guided them when they attacked monasteries. Finally, we'll explore why the Viking Age came to an end. So sit back, grab a horn of mead, and get ready to learn the truth about the Vikings in this epic episode of History Debunked. Thanks to the release of the well-known game, Vikings is back on everyone's lips. Once again, the game and many fans of Scandinavian culture are on the same rake, namely the rake of myths, prejudices, and fairy tales, which they pass off as truth. We have gone through some of the controversial points in the past two videos, but it is time to finally set the record straight and debunk perhaps the biggest myth in Viking history. The myth that they disappeared because they were lousy fighters and could only attack the defenseless. Well, let's start with the lesser mistakes. The first and craziest one somehow flies past all the history books. Almost everyone is aware of the Viking Age, the period from 793 to 1066, which in European history is marked by the domination of the Nords over Northern Europe. But somehow, not many are aware that there was never any unified state of the Vikings. Everyone first knows that a konungur is actually a king, and a jarl is a slightly smaller king or warlord. But only a few know that the Vikings never had a unified country. The entire brief but vivid history of the northern conquerors is that of small, independent principalities. Yes, these principalities could get together and elect konungars and go on campaigns as a united front, but none of the Vikings considered themselves part of any country. The jarls competed for power, the konungars changed like gloves, and the very concept of a state was only vaguely familiar to the Vikings. Most Viking settlements were in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, but few considered themselves part of anything larger. From time to time, an entire state came under the leadership of a jarl or a konungur. So, for example, Canute the Great became King of Denmark in 1018, and King of Norway in 1028, and among other things in 1016 conquered England, becoming king there as well. But this power can only be called power on paper. In the same Norway, supposedly under the power of Canute, nothing stopped the proud Viking tribes from acting on their own. They could easily go to some Africa or not appear on the general gathering announced by the king. It is worth noting, however, that a polity that the Vikings themselves had only on paper worked beautifully in England. Even after the overthrow of the Vikings, the English left some aspects of the legal system that are still in use today. And from the state, let's move on to religion. Thor, Odin, and the other guys of Scandinavian mythology are familiar to everyone, and jokes about unwashed Christians and religious wars are glimpsed in all games. And that's not entirely true, for many of the Vikings were Christians. Some units were imbued with ideas during their campaigns, but the most obvious example is Harald the Bluetooth. It is in honor of this konungur that the technology is named, and he is known for converting Denmark to Christianity. In Jelling, which is located in Denmark, there is one of the most famous runestones of the Vikings, and on it is written that Harald announces the conquest of Norway and Denmark, and that he made his people Christians. This is of course from later times and somewhere around 986, but still things are not so clear-cut with religion among the Scandinavians, and with the attitude of the public all the more so. There is no average opinion about the Vikings. Half of them will call them barbarians, and the other half will call them unappreciated geniuses. The explanation is simple and logical. The reason for the wild hatred of the Vikings in the Middle Ages is the Christian Church, because on their campaigns, especially the early ones, the Vikings often targeted monasteries. They were full of gold and silver, and the priests were poorly protected, which is why the Nords loved to rob them. And the irony is that priests were one of the few who could read, write, and spread propaganda in those days. That's why most written sources from the Middle Ages attribute a savagery to the Vikings that didn't really exist. Yes, looting monasteries is horrible, But for example, the killing of children and women that the Vikings attribute to the records of those times was not actually done by the Norse. But this is not about some mythical codexes that the Viking aficionados claim. There was no mention of mercy to children, but there was a banal logic which guided the Northerners. Why kill women and children if they could be ransomed? History has preserved a note from a priest who survived the Viking campaign on Lindisfarne Island. Traditionally, the monastery was attacked, but the Vikings did not drink the blood of the children. On the contrary, the priest Alcuin, in a letter to someone in his circle, declares that he knows who to contact to pay the ransom for the captured children. This makes sense, for in those days the nobility often sent children to study in the church. Alcuin echoes a bunch of other sources, and it's not just about the children. There is a record that in the 9th century the Vikings received a ransom for an ancient Latin book. At least this couple of facts clearly state that the Vikings were guided by cold calculation, and this already crosses over their supposedly barbaric nature. What if the captured women, men, and children weren't cool enough for ransom? That's not a problem for the Vikings. On the scale of slavery, the guys surpassed the Roman Empire. Many historians believe that slaves on the campaigns were valued even more than pure money. Markets for the sale of men stood in every self-respecting city. There is a record of a priest who visited Hedeby in 870 and was stunned by the number of Christian slaves for sale. Ironically, it is in this sad phenomenon that another myth is debunked, the myth that the Vikings were barbarians who could only war. As you can see, the slave trade flourished with the boys, and the regular trade kept pace with it. English, French, Spanish, and even African traders liked to visit Viking cities on trade missions, and they, in turn, often supplied their own. In our last video, we described in detail the Viking colonies in Canada, Greenland, and the Middle East, something no ordinary barbarians would do. Only civilizations wishing to expand their trade routes would do such a thing. Another cloudy point is the Vikings' lack of manufacturing. Yes, the guys often fought with trophy weapons, but they knew how to produce goods. Intelligent slaves with an education played a key role in this. There is another stone in Jutland, set by Toki Smith, whose name is not even Scandinavian. And on the stone, Toki declares that it was made in honor of Gudmundur, the son of Thorgisel, because Gudmundur gave him gold and freedom. It didn't happen for nothing. Toki worked as a craftsman and helped his owner a lot, and the Viking in turn thanked the slave with his freedom. This stone is another proof that the Scandinavians were guided by logic in most things, and in this respect, they were no different from the Romans, where intelligent slaves could also get freedom for their skills. Now that we've learned a few key facts about the Vikings, it's time to talk about the main point. Were the Vikings cowards who were afraid of regular armies? And is it true that they disappeared just because Europe became civilized and the Scandinavians were losing in fair fights? The main argument of the supporters of the cowardice theory of the Vikings is that the Scandinavians didn't go to the strong Spain, for example, raping the already fractured Britons. Viking haters also remind us of the Battle of Stamford Bridge. It is called the First Battle of United England against Konungur our Herald, and in this battle the Vikings suffered a crushing defeat. There are many analyses from which one gets the sense of a total inability of the Vikings to stand up to an organized army, but this is only a confluence of circumstances presented under the guise of truth. Contrast this with the Great Army of the Pagans. This is the name the British gave to the Viking army that conquered almost all of England in the 9th century. The Great Army was the heir to the army that captured Paris in 845, and King Aethelwulf's organized army, which met the Vikings in Wessex, was completely defeated, as were many other perfectly organized units. We are no experts in military science, but trivial statistics tell us that the Vikings were not afraid of armies. In fact, otherwise they would not have ruled the north of Europe for 2 centuries. But then, why did the Viking Age end and the raids cease? As is always the case, the answer is boring and down to earth. And to understand it, let's go over the facts. First of all, no one conquered the Vikings. The same defeat at Stanford was an operation in enemy territory. Neither the British, nor the French, nor the Germans landed and conquered the Vikings. Second, the Vikings did not suffer the fate of Carthage and Egypt. They were not erased from history by conquering and repainting their culture. And thirdly, the Scandinavians live to this day, and live, judging by ratings, better than the rest of the planet. It was the Vikings who disappeared. And this is the key point. Textbooks often present the end of their era in the guise of obsolescence and military defeats by Europeans. But in fact, this is not the case. The Vikings ended their era because the campaigns, a major source of slaves and gold, ceased. and the campaign stopped because of trivial progress, and 99% of it is about the progress of the Vikings. Two stories developed in parallel. In Viking territory, the Konungares and other rulers seized power more and more firmly. As a consequence, the common people were getting poorer because of the loss of property and taxes, and they did not care about overseas expeditions, but about food for their wives and sons. On the other hand, the Vikings forced Europe to develop. Monasteries were moved from the islands to the continent, fortresses were built, and mobile and armed units organized. The English, as we have already mentioned, took the best from the Viking system and adapted, and the result was a stalemate. The Vikings had problems in their campaigns on the continent, but the campaigns themselves became a problem, because there was nobody to go to them. That's why the Viking Age ended. But the key point is that the guys left with their heads held high, and we can say completely of their own free will, for all the reasons for the Viking sunset were caused by them. The guys, albeit in a peculiar way, managed to help Europe by pointing the way of development. And in parallel, they turned into European states with insane taxes and poor populations. It is sad, but that is how history works. Few things happen abruptly and unexpectedly. Most often they are caused by long and complex processes. That's exactly what happened to the Vikings. But the fact that they disappeared because of their inability to stand up to the European armies is a myth that you should not believe. That's it for now. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. And also suggest your ideas for future releases in the comments. See you soon, folks!